My last video seemed to help out a lot of people in structuring their training, but it's also raised a lot of questions too. So in this video, I thought I'd explain better how to manipulate and manage the blocks of training to suit a fighter that fights more frequently, say once a month, and still maintain progression. And also for those that are finding that a 4-week block just isn't practical to fit into the spacing between fights too. So how do you manage to shorten those down but still manage progression? And I thought I'd do that by showing you a tool that I've developed, an Excel spreadsheet that can plan your whole annual training. So if I begin by setting up the example that I finished the last video with, so we start with the strength block here, and we had 4 weeks in duration on that one, and then we followed that up with a 4-week power block, and then we had a 4-week speed and power endurance block. That matches the example I gave in my whiteboard illustration. So each of these blocks was 4 weeks, and it's low, medium, high, and a deload before we move into the next block. And on my spreadsheet here, it shows you the corresponding conditioning element as well. For strength, we've got aerobic power. For power, we've got explosive power training. And then for the speed, we've got power endurance. So in the first example, if we've got a fighter fighting every 4 weeks, this works out okay. So for example, if I had a fight that landed here on the 29th of January, and that's what I'd call a level 3 priority fight. So it's not an important one that we're going to peak optimally for. It's one we're going to kind of work through, but we just want to make sure we actually hit a deload for that week rather than a high week. So if this fight actually landed on week 3 here, on the high week, then you'd be fatigued going into the fight. So we need a deload before we went into that fight. And that would allow you to kind of just train straight through. And although I talk about a deload, it's not the same as we'd have in a traditional sense for a block of training here. The deload in this instance, because there's a fight on that week, would be low volume but still maintaining high intensity. Not necessarily for the strength training, that becomes more of a power endurance session, but the intensity of the conditioning training and the pad work would still be very high. And then going into the low week of the following block, this would be reduced volume. So we'd have low intensity, but we'd still be recovering from this fight. So I'd perhaps drop this to just one of the strength training sessions rather than the 2 typically I'd have in a week, and then go for the 2 on the following medium week, and then up to the high intensity again. Then potentially we've got another fight. If we say we had one here on the 25th of this month, and again, that's a level 3 priority fight there. One we're going to train through, kind of treating it like a friendly, if there is such a thing. So it's not a massively important fight, and actually the progression on the strength and conditioning training is more important than the fight. The fight is just getting in and keeping your hand in, and not necessarily changing anything in terms of rankings or anything else. A level 2 fight would be, or a 2 priority fight would be one that you would try and peak for, but still the progression of the strength and conditioning is the priority rather than the fight. It's a high profile fight, but we're not looking to optimize the periodization for it. A priority 1 fight would be like a title fight where everything is geared around it, and we structure the training specifically to taper for the best performance in that fight. So this one's a level 3. We're still training through. We're not changing the block emphasis here. We're just making sure we land on a deload. And then of course, we'd have the same sort of thing here for our fight here that lands on the deload here of the speed and power endurance block. This incidentally would be the best performing fight, because the end of a speed and power endurance would be really optimized for that. So this, out of all of these fights, if this was the priority 2 or priority 1 fight, even for a title fight, this would be the best performance. So that's how I'd structure it if we had literally 4 weeks going into each of these blocks, and fighting every 4 weeks as well. If they landed on the deload, then you've got things matching really well. So this is what I'd call a 3-to-1 ratio. So it's 3 loading weeks here and then 1 deload week. So what if this fight here didn't actually land? Put that back to a priority 3. If that fight didn't land on this week, if it landed on this week instead. So if we had that landing on the 19th of March instead, and we'll make that level 3. Let's get rid of these two. So now a fight lands here. If this landed on a high week, this would be no good because you'd be fatigued. So we need to shift this around so that we now change our 4-week block into a 3-week block. So if I do that, then the intensities here, we now go medium and high and then deload in time for that fight. So the fight's at the end of the week, so we can deload going into that. Like I say, that's a deload in terms of volume, but not intensity for the conditioning training on that one. So this block here, a 3-week block, would be a 2-to-1 ratio. So 2 loading weeks and 1 deload week. And then the structure I use for a 2-week block, if I needed to do that, would be a 1-to-1 ratio. And for that, I'd go straight into a high week and then deload the following week. So if our fight shifted up to here, that would be a way of progressing that one. But the best progression in terms of athletic development will be with a 4-week block. If we're using a 3-week block or a 2-week block, then we are sacrificing some of the development that we can get. It's making best of a reduced timescale. Incidentally, a 1-week block on here is not going to leave you able to change any kind of development. You're basically going in with what you've got. So it's literally straight into a peaking week and that's it. If you've got longer, so if I just get rid of this now, if you've got longer and you want to optimize your blocks, then what I do is, for example, if you had a 4-week speed block and I can actually afford to extend that out, I would take it as far as doing a second speed block afterwards, which would then cycle through again to make that 8 weeks in total. And this would still see that progression of between 1 and 5% on the high levels here. And that would give you a double back-to-back block of really progressing that particular quality that we're developing. It's important that there's a deload here to allow sufficient recovery to whip that back up again to a higher level. If you miss that out, then you're going to end up too fatigued at this stage to do a good job of that. But if I just get rid of that again for a moment here, and typically what we would have after continuing a whole block like this, I would actually finish this with a recovery block, and that would either be 1 week or anything between 1 and 4 weeks typically, but 2 weeks works quite nicely, and that we have in a progression just from a low and medium. And if it was a 3 weeks, I'd go up to a high, and then you'd go into your next block. Potentially, if we had 4 weeks, then we would have a bit of a deload before we then went into your next block. But typically, I'd stick that at 2 weeks, and then because we've finished a full cycle here of strength, power, and speed, I would then move into a strength block again here that ideally would have 4 weeks in that, and then we'd start through the cycle again. But I can play around here with my blocks to actually get what I need. If this fighter was weaker and strength was the emphasis, I'd keep a full 4-week block on that and then squeeze in perhaps a couple of shorter blocks before a peak date here if I needed to get a deload here for a fight that happened around here. So I hope that gives you a better idea how you can manipulate your training blocks to match whatever your training schedule is. If something crops up like a fight or an illness or holidays, that's another thing I kind of whack in here. If we've got holidays coming up, then I'd put those in and plan around those as well. And if you like the look of this Excel spreadsheet that I put together to plan your annual training, you can buy that from the website too, along with instructional videos and a guideline booklet on how to manage the training blocks.